Blood drips slowly from the executioner's knife, each cut a whisper of agony in the crowded square, where the victim's screams echo through history's darkest corners. Welcome to the chilling story of Lingchi, the death by 1,000 cuts that terrorized Imperial China. Grab a cup of tea, take a seat, and settle in for this suspenseful journey. If you're hooked and enjoying the tale, hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us. Chapter 1. The Origins of Lingchi, a punishment born from chaos. Let's dive right into where this brutal practice began. Lingchi, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts or slow slicing, wasn't just any execution method. It was a spectacle designed to instill fear and maintain order in a vast empire plagued by rebellions and crimes. Emerging during the Liao dynasty around the 10th century, it evolved from earlier forms of dismemberment punishments mentioned in ancient texts like the Book of Han. Historians trace its roots to a time when rulers needed extreme deterrence against treason, parricide or mass murder, acts that threatened the Confucian social hierarchy. For example, in the Song dynasty, records show it being applied to rebels who challenged the emperor's divine mandate, with the slow, methodical cuts symbolizing the gradual erosion of the criminal's humanity. This wasn't random violence. It was ritualized, often performed in public, to educate the masses on the consequences of disloyalty. By the Ming and Qing dynasties, it had become formalized in legal codes, reserved for the most heinous offenses. Think about it. In an era without modern prisons, such displays reinforced imperial power. We've set the stage with its ancient beginnings. Next, we'll explore how this evolved into a horrifying art form. Chapter 2. The Ritual of Lingchi, a choreographed dance of death. The air in the execution square was thick with tension, the crowd's murmurs blending with the clink of the executioner's blade against a sharpening stone. Lingchi was no hasty act of violence. It was a meticulously choreographed ritual designed to prolong suffering while showcasing the emperor's absolute authority. By the time the Ming dynasty solidified its use, this punishment had transformed into a grim performance, blending precision, symbolism, and terror. The process began with the condemned being bound to a wooden post or cross in a bustling public square, stripped of clothing to expose their flesh to the crowd and the blade. Executioners, often trained for years, wielded a small, razor-sharp knife, making deliberate incisions, sometimes as few as 8, sometimes hundreds, each cut calculated to avoid vital organs and prolong the victim's agony. Historical records from the Qing dynasty describe how the cuts followed a specific pattern, starting with non-lethal areas like the arms, legs, and torso. The executioner worked methodically, slicing away small pieces of flesh while the victim remained conscious, their screams a grim lesson to onlookers. The ritual wasn't just about pain, it was symbolic, rooted in Confucian ideals of justice, where the body's destruction mirrored the criminal's moral decay. Spectators, from peasants to officials, were meant to witness the state's power to unmake a person, piece by piece. Court documents from the 17th century note that executioners were sometimes instructed to reach a precise number of cuts, 1,000 in some cases, before delivering a fatal blow, though many victims succumbed to shock or blood loss far earlier. The ritual's public nature amplified its impact, turning marketplaces into theaters of horror where loyalty to the emperor was reaffirmed through blood. As the executioner's blade danced, the crowd saw not just punishment, but a warning etched in flesh. This grim spectacle set the stage for how Lingchi shaped society's fears. Next, we'll uncover the crimes that warranted such a fate. Chapter 3. Crimes that sealed a gruesome fate. The sun beat down on the execution square, where the condemned stood tied, their fate sealed by acts so heinous they shook the foundations of Imperial China's rigid moral order. Lingchi wasn't a punishment handed out lightly. It was reserved for crimes that struck at the heart of the empire's values, threatening the harmony upheld by Confucian principles. In the Ming and Qing dynasties, only the gravest offences warranted this slow, torturous death. Treason topped the list. Plotting against the emperor, seen as the son of heaven, was an unforgivable betrayal. Historical records from the Qing dynasty detail cases like that of a disloyal general in the 18th century, who conspired to overthrow the throne and faced Lingchi as his punishment, his body carved apart before a silent crowd. Parricide, killing one's own parents or elders, was another crime deemed monstrous, as it violated the sacred duty of filial piety. A chilling example comes from a 16th century Ming court case, where a man who murdered his father over a land dispute was subjected to Lingchi, his punishment recorded as a warning in local annals. Mass murder or banditry that destabilized entire regions also qualified, as seen in accounts of rebel leaders during the Taiping Rebellion, whose executions drew thousands to witness the state's retribution. These crimes weren't just personal failings, they were assaults on the cosmic order, demanding a response that matched their severity. The law codes of the time, like the Qing's Great Code, explicitly outlined Lingchi for such acts, ensuring the punishment fit the crime's weight in the eyes of both the emperor and the heavens. The condemned, often paraded through streets before their execution, carried the weight of their deeds into the square, where their suffering would serve as a public lesson. With the crimes clear, we'll next explore the executioners themselves, men who turned death into an art. Chapter 4. The Executioners, Masters of a Macabre Craft. The execution square buzzed with a strange mix of dread and anticipation, the crowd's eyes fixed not only on the condemned, but also on the figure wielding the blade. A man whose skill turned Lingchi into a chilling art form. In Imperial China, executioners were not mere butchers, they were trained professionals, often operating under the weight of a grim legacy passed down through generations. These men, shrouded in both fear and a peculiar kind of respect, were the architects of Lingchi's horror, their precision ensuring the punishment's symbolic power. To understand Lingchi fully, we must step into the world of these executioners, exploring their training, their role in society, and the psychological toll of their craft. Executioners in the Ming and Qing dynasties were typically drawn from low-status groups, sometimes hereditary roles assigned to families who had little choice in the matter. Historical records, such as those from the Qing dynasty's Board of Punishments, describe how executioners were often trained from a young age, learning the anatomy of the human body with a focus on prolonging life during torture, rather than ending it swiftly. This wasn't about random cruelty. It was about control. A skilled executioner could make a single incision, perhaps no larger than a coin, that caused excruciating pain without triggering fatal blood loss. They studied the body's pressure points, muscles, and nerve clusters, ensuring each cut maximized suffering while keeping the victim conscious. For instance, a 17th century manual on judicial punishments, preserved in Beijing's archives, details how executioners practiced on animals or cadavers to perfect their technique, learning to slice away flesh in a way that avoided major arteries for as long as possible. The goal was to stretch the ordeal, sometimes over hours, to fulfill the ritual's purpose as a public deterrent. The executioner's tools were simple but deadly. A small curved knife, sharpened to a razor's edge, was the weapon of choice, its blade designed for precision rather than brute force. Some accounts mention a set of knives, each reserved for specific parts of the body, cleaned meticulously between cuts to maintain the ritual's ceremonial cleanliness. The executioner's movements were almost theatrical, described in court records as a slow, deliberate dance, each slice accompanied by a pause to let the victim's screams ripple through the crowd. This wasn't just about inflicting pain, it was about performance. The executioner had to balance the demands of the state, prolonging the punishment to satisfy justice with the crowd's expectations, who saw the spectacle as both entertainment and moral lesson. In one documented case from the 18th century, an executioner in Guangzhou was praised for completing 120 precise cuts over 2 hours before the victim finally succumbed, earning him a reputation as a master of his craft. But what was life like for these men outside the execution square? Executioners occupied a strange place in society, feared, shunned, yet indispensable. They often lived on the fringes, segregated from their communities due to the stigma of their work. In some regions, they were forbidden from marrying into respectable families, their role seen as tainted by death. Yet, their skills were so specialized that they held a certain authority within the judicial system. Some executioners, particularly in the Qing dynasty, were salaried employees of the state, receiving modest pay and occasional bonuses for particularly high-profile executions. A rare account from a 19th century magistrate's diary describes an executioner who, after performing Lingchi on a notorious bandit leader, was given a small plot of land as a reward, though he was still barred from entering the local temple due to his unclean profession. This duality, being both essential and ostracized, shaped their lives, forcing them to navigate a world that needed their skills but despised their presence. The psychological burden of their work was immense. While few personal accounts from executioners survive, anecdotes from officials suggest that many turned to alcohol or opium to cope with the weight of their actions. One story from the late Ming dynasty tells of an executioner who, after performing Lingchi on a rebel leader, refused to touch his knife for weeks, claiming he saw the victim's face in his dreams. Yet, the state demanded unwavering professionalism. Executioners who botched a Lingchi by killing the victim too quickly or failing to follow the prescribed ritual could face punishment themselves, ranging from fines to imprisonment. This pressure to perform perfectly under the gaze of both the crowd and the officials added another layer of complexity to their role. The executioner's craft wasn't just about skill. It was about embodying the emperor's justice. Each cut was a statement, a physical manifestation of the state's power to punish those who defied it. The crowd, watching in a mix of horror and fascination, saw not just a man with a knife, but the hand of the empire itself. As the executioner wiped his blade and stepped back from the post, the victim's broken body served as a grim testament to the cost of rebellion or betrayal. With the executioner's role laid bare, we'll next turn to the victims themselves, those who faced Lingchi's terror, and the stories that defined their final moments. Chapter 5. The Legacy of Lingchi. A dark echo in history. The execution square lies silent now, the bloodstains long washed away by time, yet the shadow of Lingchi lingers in the collective memory of a nation and beyond. As the Qing dynasty crumbled and the modern world emerged, this brutal practice faded, but its impact on culture, law, and human rights reverberates through history. In this final chapter, we'll explore how Lingchi came to an end, its lasting influence on Chinese society, and the lessons it leaves for us today. This is the story of a punishment that, though extinct, continues to haunt our understanding of justice and cruelty. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, China was undergoing seismic changes. The Qing dynasty, weakened by internal rebellions and external pressures from Western powers, faced growing criticism of its judicial practices. Lingchi, with its grotesque spectacle, became a focal point for reformists and foreign observers alike. Western missionaries and diplomats, arriving in greater numbers during the 19th century, were horrified by the practice. Photographs of Lingchi executions, some taken by French soldiers in the 1900s, circulated in Europe, fueling outrage and reinforcing stereotypes of China as a barbaric nation. These images, showing victims bound and mutilated in public squares, were published in newspapers and books, sparking debates about human rights and the ethics of punishment. For example, a 1905 photograph from Beijing, preserved in a French archive, depicts a man enduring Lingchi, his face contorted in agony as the executioner carves his chest. Such images pressured the Qing government, which was desperate to modernize and gain international respect. Within China, reformist intellectuals like Kang Yuwei and Liang Qichao pushed for legal modernization, arguing that practices like Lingchi were relics of a bygone era that hindered China's progress. The Guangxu Emperor's 100 Days Reform in 1898, though short-lived, included calls to abolish cruel punishments. By 1905, the Qing government, under mounting internal and external pressure, officially abolished Lingchi as part of a broader overhaul of the penal code. The decision was formalized in a decree from the Board of Punishments, which replaced Lingchi with quicker methods like beheading or later firing squads. The last recorded Lingchi execution took place in 1905, marking the end of a centuries-long tradition. A court record from that year describes the execution of a bandit leader in Shaanxi province, noting that the practice was discontinued immediately after, as the empire sought to align with global standards of justice. Yet, the end of Lingchi didn't erase its cultural footprint. In Chinese literature and folklore, the punishment lived on as a symbol of ultimate retribution. Stories of Lingchi lingered in oral traditions, often exaggerated to emphasize the terror of defying authority. For instance, a 1920s folktale from Fujian province tells of a ghostly figure, a Lingchi victim, wandering village streets, his wounds still bleeding, warning children to obey their elders. This imagery reinforced the punishment's role as a moral lesson even after its abolition. In popular culture, Lingchi appeared in early 20th century novels and plays, often as a metaphor for societal decay or the dangers of unchecked power. Even today, references to death by 1,000 cuts appear in Chinese idioms, used to describe prolonged suffering or incremental harm, showing how deeply the practice embedded itself in the language and psyche. Globally, Lingchi's legacy shaped discussions about torture and human rights. The photographs and accounts that shocked Western audiences contributed to early 20th century campaigns against cruel punishments worldwide. Organizations like the Red Cross, emerging during this period, cited Lingchi as an example of why universal standards for humane treatment were needed. Historians argue that the abolition of Lingchi was a pivotal moment in China's transition toward modern legal systems, influencing the Republic of China's penal reforms after the Qing's fall in 1912. The shift also reflected a broader rethinking of punishment's purpose, from public spectacle to rehabilitation or deterrence, aligning with global trends. The psychological impact of Lingchi's history persists too. Scholars studying trauma in Chinese history note that communities near execution sites often pass down stories of the horror affecting generations. In some villages, elders recounted how children were forbidden from watching Lingchi, yet the sounds of screams carried through the streets, leaving lasting fear. Modern psychologists might argue this collective trauma shaped attitudes toward authority and justice, fostering a deep-seated aversion to excessive cruelty in some communities. Museums in China, like the Beijing Police Museum, display artifacts from the Qing penal system, including executioners' knives, as a reminder of this dark chapter and a warning against repeating it. Reflecting on Lingchi today, it's tempting to see it as a distant, barbaric relic, but it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice and spectacle. How different are modern forms of public shaming or media-driven outrage from the crowds that gathered to watch Lingchi? The practice reminds us of the fine line between justice and cruelty, and the power of fear to shape societies. Its abolition marked a step toward a world that values human dignity, but its memory challenges us to remain vigilant against cruelty in any form. As we close this journey through the chilling history of Lingchi, I hope you've been gripped by the stories of its origins, rituals, victims, and executioners. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into Imperial China's darkest corners, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and comment below with your thoughts. Your support means everything to us. Thank you for joining me in this haunting tale, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll uncover another forgotten chapter of history. Stay curious and take care.